This podcast episode is sponsored by Black Diamond Therapeutics. Black Diamond Therapeutics is pioneering the development of MasterKey therapies. Cancer is a complex and ever-evolving disease, yet current targeted therapies may address only a limited subset of oncogenic mutations. Black Diamond's MasterKey approach aims to expand the addressable patient population by offering one solution for many mutations. BDTX 1535, an investigational agent targeting EGFR-positive non-small cell lung cancer, is currently in Phase 2 clinical trials. Please contact your healthcare provider to see if a clinical trial is right for you.
Hello, and welcome to Young Lung Cancer Initiative's Truth Talk podcast. My name is Leah Phillips, and I'm a co-founding member of the Young Lung Cancer Initiative. I was diagnosed with Stage IV EGFR lung cancer in December of 2019 at 43 years old. I am married and have 3 children, and I live in Louisville, Kentucky. Karly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Karly Renn. I am currently 44 years old. I live in Salina, Texas. I have 4 children, fantastic husband, and I was diagnosed with Stage IV EGFR lung cancer in June of 2022.
Thank you. Dr. Hajdenberg, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Leah. I'm Julio Hajdenberg. I'm a medical oncologist, and I also work as executive medical director with Black Diamond Therapeutics in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Awesome, thank you. Well, today's episode is about misconceptions of clinical trials. This topic is a hot topic amongst the Young Lung Cancer Initiative patients or group, as well as the EGFR resistors. All of us are kind of in the same boat in that we want to live the longest, healthiest life that we possibly can, but we also know that the reality of our disease is that oftentimes there is progression and another drug will be needed. So that's why we're here today, and we really are excited to figure out what Black Diamond has in the pipeline, and we appreciate their sponsorship and their partnership in this patient-focused discussion centered around the misconceptions of clinical trials. We felt it was really important to collaborate with Black Diamond Therapeutics on this topic because they have some very interesting drugs and treatments, and they have some in the pipeline. And as we all know, every medication we take has to go through a clinical trial phase in order to be approved by the FDA. Karly, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your diagnosis of EGFR lung cancer and how it was discovered?
Sure. I think all of us have kind of a unique story, but mine presented with no respiratory symptoms whatsoever. I considered myself at the time in wonderful health. I was very active on my Peloton and had not experienced any of those common symptoms that are often described as shortness of breath or coughing. I was actually at work when I started to experience some neurological changes that were a little mild, but also working in an ER, I knew that they were concerning. And I went to the ER and was checked in and started a workup for a stroke. And what they actually found were 3 large masses in my brain that then led them to complete a full body scan, and they discovered a large mass in my right lung. And later it was biopsy and confirmed that it was in fact a non-small cell carcinoma. And I had an EGFR mutation.
I think that's more common than not that you have these findings because you're in the doctor's office for something else, and then they're looking at your heart or whatnot and they see the cancer elsewhere. So although that's not a traditional way of diagnosis, I think it is common. Can you tell us right now what treatment you're on and how you're doing?
I'm still considered on my first line treatment. After it was confirmed that I did have the EGFR mutation, I was started on Tagrisso. I actually remember the date. I was started July 12th, 2022. I'm currently still on Tagrisso. I have had gamma knife radiation for the masses in my brain, and I did have radiation about 6 months into my treatment to the primary tumor in my lung, as well as localized radiation to a spot, 2 spots last summer in the T12 and my 9th rib. And then working with one of my physicians suggested that I stay on the Tagrisso, but there had been a new study that had come out that recommended first-line patients add in about 4 rounds of chemotherapy, which I completed in December through January of this last year. And today I'm still on Tagrisso.
Okay, so you kind of had some ups and downs and, you know, and had some different experiences with different treatment options for sure. So as you know, we're here today to talk about the misconceptions of clinical trials, especially in the patient population. Could you maybe, do you have any questions or do you have any thoughts on your preconceived notions of clinical trials?
Yes, I, like many people, knew nothing about clinical trials, how they work, where they even begin. And so I think just learning along the way has somewhat times seemed a little overwhelming. And then questions I've thought about is, when I hear of promising clinical trials, what does this mean if I participate? Do I still get the standard of care? Do I stop my current treatments? Who's eligible for a clinical trial? What if you participate in a clinical trial? Does it exclude you from any treatments in the future? I think those are things that I've thought of, and as I've learned to look at different clinical trials and think of what's the next step for me? How do I find one, and how do I become a participant if it's needed? Perfect.
So I'd like to kind of turn it over to Dr. Hajdenberg and ask you a few questions, maybe to get some answers for Karly and other patients that are listening in today. Can you explain to us when clinical trials actually will come into play in a patient's care?
Well, it depends a lot on what disease we're talking about, and we're talking today about EGFR-driven lung cancer. And it also depends on the individual patient's situation. Is this an early stage, say stage 2, EGFR driven lung cancer that's going to be treated with surgery, for example? And so there were questions a few years ago where we didn't know whether you needed to give EGFR targeting drugs after surgery for patients that have stage 2 EGFR-driven lung cancer. So we needed to do clinical trials to see if there was any benefit of adding such treatments after surgery. And that would have been a patient newly diagnosed, so that would have been appropriate. So you also have patients, for example, that may have been on standard therapy, and that therapy is no longer working. And maybe when they did genetic testing, repeat genetic testing, because that standard therapy is no longer working, they've identified a new mutation that could be associated with resistance to that drug. And there could be a new treatment that's promising that might be able to benefit that patient. Therefore, it could be worth for that patient that could be facing a standard chemotherapy treatment to consider a new targeted agent, personalized medicine type of agent, because there's that type of mutation that the discoverers of this drug have discovered. Or there could be a trial where you are combining one existing regimen and a new novel regimen, because maybe you want to augment whatever results you were getting from the established regimen, and you want to see, okay, can we do better than we're currently doing? So it depends really on the patient. And this is something that it also depends on who your doctor is and what kind of access they have to those clinical trials. Doctors may be running clinical trials, maybe in their individual practices, or they're part of a large cancer program or a large institution, and they have what we call a portfolio or a pipeline of clinical trials that they may have built over the years to offer patients, let's say with EGFR non-small cell lung cancer, but they have it individualized, patients with stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, first line, second line, third line, in combination with radiation. somebody with brain metastasis. So it depends on what type of program you've been working with that you may have access to different clinical trials. And it also depends on your personal inclination towards trying something like that. Do you feel confident in the institution or in the physician? Do you think you trust what your doctor or nurses are telling you that are possible better options for you than standard of care? Or you decide, okay, I'm going to get standard of care for the time being, and if things don't work, I'll try a clinical trial. So all these possibilities happen. The important thing is to be informed, and your oncologist should be able to provide you with whatever they have available at their site, or they could also give you information at what maybe other sites in the community or in the state are trying to do.
I think that answers, I think that's a good answer. Like, it just depends on the patient when the appropriate time is for a clinical trial. And I guess I know a lot of people want to know, like, how do we find these clinical trials? I know you're saying like your oncologist could help you, but from my experience talking with multiple patients is that not all, especially smaller hospitals or doctors, are well versed in the clinical trials. So if, as a patient, I know my husband and I both like to research kind of what's the next best thing and try to stay on top of it. Do you have any advice on how patients can find like the access or where these clinical trials are taking place on their own without the doctor's help?
Yeah. To tell the truth, the best thing is if you have a well-informed doctor, a well-connected doctor, that's probably the most efficient way to get access to this, because it is not your job. You have been trained to look for clinical. It's something new. You're going to be, testing on your own. It's like learning a new skill, and there's a lot of noise out there, so it will get very confusing. You go on the internet, you use whatever search engine, and it's very scary, and turns out most of the information you're going to find out may not be applicable to your situation. So all you did is confuse yourself, you exhausted yourself, and now you're more scared than before. So I would say a very good place to start is indeed your oncology facility, your doctor. Now, you're right. In some locations, some doctors may not be doing a lot of clinical trials, so that's probably not going to be very efficient. Another way could be if you're in a city or in a state. Most states will have what we call NCI designated cancer centers. And these NCI designated cancer centers have clinical trial offices, and it's probably a good idea to contact, in this case would be the lung cancer section, and try to find out from somebody that's running clinical trials there what they have to offer, maybe even get a second opinion consultation. That's probably also not an inefficient way of doing it, because that is their business, and they may be able to distill for you what's more useful. Maybe you're in a community where, I happen to live in Boston, so there's a lot of places here where I can go find out. But if you're in Louisville, Kentucky, actually you do have you do have an NCI designated cancer center in this state, but you probably only have one. So It depends on where you are in Kentucky. It may be more or less difficult to go there. So it really depends on where you are. Now, then it gets trickier. There's a general site where patients and their families can look for clinical trials called clinicaltrials.gov, which is an NCI government sponsored repository of trials, which are not just in the US, they're global. And you're entering the disease you have, which may not be cancer, would be all kinds of things, but in this case, we're talking about cancer. They also ask you to enter the stage. If you know the stage, they also ask you to enter the location, could be United States or could be everywhere. They also ask you to select whether it's for treatment or diagnosis. It can be a little bit confusing. So it will give you eventually a list of clinical trials. It could be a little bit daunting to do that. You could print that list and discuss this with your oncologist and see if any of those make sense. And then you have some advocacy groups and some groups, you mentioned young resistors before, for example, groups like that, KRAS kickers in lung cancer that, specialize in supporting patients and providing them information about initiatives that are going on there. Sometimes some organizations have funds to help with transportation and things like that. So I find that these organizations, they're really motivated, and they provide useful information, or they can contact you with people that can provide you useful information. I think between, your physician, if they're well informed, the National Comprehensive Cancer Center in your state or city, that would be good. Clinicaltrials.gov, printing a list and discussing these with their oncologist would be useful. Advocacy and patient groups are useful too. I think with that you have plenty to start with.
Okay, that's great.
What I wouldn't do is necessarily start calling individual companies, because that can get a little bit confusing. So
Right.
you can go look at the websites. All these companies do have a pipeline and they describe what the trial is, but it is confusing.
Yes, and I think you've provided a lot of clarity there, just with those options of, speaking with your doctor, going to National Cancer Institute in your area, and then also the website, the clinical website, clinicaltrials.gov, which we'll make sure to clarify that and put that in our comments as well. As far as qualifying for a clinical trial, I know when I've talked to other patients, some patients, or the majority of patients, actually feel like this has to be your last ditch effort. And I know we talked a little bit about this could be a early stage clinical trial, like if you're stage 2 or whatnot. But what are some things that would help you, or what would you need to be able to qualify for a clinical trial?
Yeah, so again, it depends on the particular stage. Is this newly diagnosed? Is this somebody that already has tried one prior therapy? Is this somebody that has tried multiple lines of therapies? Is this trial selecting based on some particular genetic abnormality that you have? Is this a trial that's looking at surgical treatment in combination with something else? So we call those the inclusion criteria, and the inclusion criteria will vary according to the particular trial. There's some general inclusion criteria that tend to be universal. For example, we're talking about lung cancer, which is an adult disease. So you need to be an adult that can consent. If you cannot consent, you cannot do it. Now, there are trials for pediatrics where, they can assent, or sometimes the parents provide consent. So there are ways around that for pediatric cancers too. You need to have, in general, reasonable organ function. You don't need to be normal or totally normal, because with years, you could have a little bit of liver damage, a little bit of kidney damage. You could have a little bit of anemia. So they don't always necessarily look for perfectly normal values, but you need to have values that are enough to put you in a situation where you're not going to be exposed to a very high risk of getting anemia or of needing dialysis or anything like that. So you need to have a certain amount of stamina. They also want you to have what's called a performance status that's acceptable. And this performance status, there are different scales for them, but a simple one goes from 0 to 4. And in general, a lot of clinical trials accept patients with performance status 0, meaning you're working full time or able to carry normal activities, or performance 1, which is almost that you're living independently and you're carrying almost everything. And sometimes they allow for performance status 2, which is more limited you can do, but we realize these patients are sicker. And then there are usually some specific details about your condition. You will need some biopsy report to document. In this particular case, it was EGFR positive lung cancer. That's necessary. And then they will do at some point a repeat of scans. They'll do CT scans of the chest. They may do an MRI of the brain to do what we call the staging prior to starting, because they want to give you some treatment, and maybe in 2 or 3 months later, they want to re-image you and see, okay, is this treatment working or not? Because if it's working, we'll continue. And if it's not working, we look for something else.
Okay,
so those are the general things there. So you need to be in relatively reasonable health, but you do not need to be perfect. And over the years, we've made some modifications. For example, it used to be that we tended to exclude patients with HIV. And nowadays, we include a lot of patients with HIV as long as their HIV condition or virus is controlled. And the same goes for hepatitis B or C. So we allow for more of those things.
that's great information to know. I know when we spoke prior to this podcast, just when we were talking about this, I found it interesting to say that you pointed out that any drug that a person is taking has been a clinical trial before. Somebody had to use it as a trial. Can you kind of just explain how that process works and why, being on maybe first line Tagrisso, why a clinical trial drug may be actually better or more effective than the gold standard because of the time that it's being developed and how long the drugs have been out and whatnot.
Yeah, so with Tagrisso, with any other drug that's being used, for example, in first line treatment of any cancer, in general, drugs that are currently being used in first line, when they were first tested, they were tested in second or third line. And turns out when they were tested in that setting, second line of recurrent cancers, the trials were successful and the drugs usually were approved for that indication, second or third line. And sometimes the case was, oh, these drugs did so well in second or third line, maybe there's an advantage in testing them in first line. So there was obviously a group of patients that volunteered that thought, maybe this treatment I'm getting for cancer of the gallbladder is not that great. And they're testing this new drug that in the second line or third line look quite promising for the treatment of, we're talking about gallbladder cancer, look promising. So we're treating patients on new drug versus the old drug for gallbladder cancer. And and you will have at that point some information as to, okay, how good was this drug in second or third line? And say, okay, this was pretty good in that setting. So it looks quite promising. And the doctor might tell you, it's worth the trial. And going a little bit back to one of the questions I think you may have asked before is, this may not preclude you, even going the clinical trial, of getting some subsequent treatment later. So, and in general, for first-line treatments, you're almost never compared to placebo. You're always being compared to the standard of care, whatever the standard of care is. So you're going to get treatment A, or you're going to get treatment B, or sometimes you get treatment A, and the other part is A plus B. So you're always getting active treatment. It's very unusual you're going to get placebo in cancer treatments in general. Sometimes we do. But in first line, since we already have first line treatments for almost everything, it's going to be compared to that. But it's not always A versus B. Sometimes it's A versus A plus B. And sometimes it's 3 arms. Sometimes you're comparing 2 doses of the new regimen.
That's great. That's great information. I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell us about Black Diamond and the BDTX 1535 trial that's going on and what this could mean for EGFR non-small cell lung cancer patients.
Yeah. So thank you for asking that question, Leah. So we're very excited about this. This is our most advanced program right now. And what we're interested in doing is through the trial of BDTX 1535 is to address a few needs in the EGFR-driven non-small cell lung cancer community of patients that at this point are already getting treatment with first-line therapy, whichever the first-line therapy is. But we know that at some point, many of these patients may need something else. And sometimes the situation arises that on a first-line tyrosine kinase inhibitor, a mutation develops in the EGFR gene that doesn't allow the current treatment to continue to work. So we have developed a drug called 1535 that specifically targets one of these mutations, which happens to be in what we call C797S, and can function or can inhibit EGFR by attaching itself to this location. And we've done preclinical studies, and we've done what we call phase 1 studies. And right now we're conducting phase 2 studies in patients that have acquired resistance to current tyrosine kinase inhibitors mediated by this particular mutation. That's one. In addition to this, there are other mutations that happen in EGFR, which we call non-classical mutations. Some people call them uncommon mutations, that historically have been more difficult to treat with the conventional tyrosine kinase inhibitors or traditional treatments we use for that. And we think they gave me an opportunity for patients that already tried those drugs, if they progress on those drugs, to participate in a trial that's using, again, this novel agent. What we're doing right now is we're conducting the trials in multiple sites in the United States to trying to determine what we call the safety, what type of side effects you get, the best way to dose it, and to understand to what extent this is going to work and to what extent is going to benefit patients. So this is ongoing. So hopefully, in a few months, we'll be able to provide some updates and tell you, how this is working out. But we've been very surprised by very positive attitude by investigators and patients that have continued to enroll in the study. So this is a project that's ongoing.
That's awesome. I think you have definitely answered a lot of questions that patients have and caregivers about clinical trials, and kind of really cleared up the misconceptions that this is not just the end of the road type of thing, like that this can be beneficial no matter what stage of diagnosis you're in. So I do really want to thank you for being here today and sharing your expertise with us on clinical trials. I'd like to thank Karly as well for sharing her thoughts and her story. I think both of us have learned the importance of clinical trials and making sure we know how to find clinical trials, enroll in clinical trials, because all of us, the goal is to stay stable with this cancer and not have progression. Karly, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Thank you for letting me participate and hear about Black Diamond. I think I've learned, like I mentioned before, just how important clinical trials are and how it helps us gain access to, the next cutting edge treatment. And then I like that you mentioned the pipeline, like that's a good way to describe it, how, we can find information about the various clinical trials and then speaking to our oncologist to see if we qualify and are we ready for one. I think that it, kind of all makes sense. And for someone like me, it definitely gives me a lot of hope. Like we've talked about before, Leah, like we're living in a time where, the treatment is out there, and I'm excited to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hajdenberg, do you have any final comments?
I have a couple of comments that I hope your audience will find useful. One is that we like offering our patients the latest and the greatest. And our patients also want to be treated with the latest and the greatest, but just understand whatever the latest is today that's FDA approved, it's usually the result of some concept that's maybe 10 years old or older. It took that long to get it here. So having access to clinical trials is something that's really new that's going on right now, because what a lot of people, some treatments that we have right now are really, really good and it's great. But what you're receiving right now as treatment is not that new. So it's very important to try to have access to treatments that could be the next thing, that appear safe, rationally designed, with trials that are conducted in a professional way, that are able to offer patients hope, and that hopefully will become the standard of care in 3, 5, or 10 years from today. The other thing that is very important is that, I think as Carol just saying, we're living in very interesting times where the development of new treatments has accelerated exponentially. And it is very important to gain time, when you have advanced cancer. Whatever amount of time you can get, it will get you, hopefully, to the next step. And we're also in a situation where new treatments may be vastly superior to older treatments. It used to be in the past that new treatments were a little bit better than older treatments, but we may be developing treatments sometimes that are a lot better than whatever prior treatments we had before. So whenever you can gain a little bit of time or a substantial amount of time, it's very important. Let me give you an example. 2 years in oncology it's an eternity in terms of the new drugs that get approved. Not everything in lung cancer, not everything in EGFR-driven lung cancer. But if you look at the new treatments that are being developed, presented, approved, discussed, there's a lot of very exciting discovery that's going on, and it does offer a lot of hope. And this could be small molecules, they could be antibodies, they could be cellular therapies, they could be things we don't even know that people are working on today. So it's very important to stay around as healthy as possible. So hopefully you or your family members will have access to these type of therapies in the future. Just you need to make sure that these trials are conducted in a professional way, that you understand the risks, that you understand what's known so far, the potential side effects. And some of them may be apt for first line, some may be adequate for second line or third line.
That's great information. If patients want to learn more about the Black Diamond, just Black Diamond itself, or the new trial that you're working on for the EGFR lung cancer, is there, or what's in the pipeline even, is there a way we can find more information? Is there a place to go to look for that?
Yeah, you can use your website as enough information, I think, in terms of the pipeline and what's going on, BDTX.com.
Perfect. That's great. And we'll make sure we link that information in the description of our podcast. And I would like to take a few minutes just to really thank both of you. I think hearing from a patient is so very valuable. I think other patients connect well, and then to have a professional that's kind of facilitating, like explaining to us in layman terms, if you'd like, so we can understand it and really take it in and apply this to our situation either now or in the future when it becomes necessary. So I do want to thank both of you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.